Hi, everyone. My name is Ginny Catania. For those of you who don't know me, I am in the Institute for Geophysics and Department for the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences now. And I'm really happy to introduce Mike White, who's here to do some filming for Switch, but then asked to meet with climate scientists and give a couple presentations on the work that he does. He's been at Nature for a number of years, since 2008.
Yeah, 16 years.
And he is a senior editor there, where he covers all topics related to climate, water, atmosphere, ocean, and the cryosphere. And he's here to talk about, he earlier gave a talk or an Ask Me Anything to students and stuff on campus. And now he's going to talk about publishing in Nature, which is an exciting topic for many of us. So please join me in welcoming Mike to UT.
Thanks, Ginny. Thank you all for coming. I've been trying to come to UT for many years, so it's great to finally be able to visit with all of you. I have a pretty simple goal for today's talk, which is largely to try and answer this question for you. And you might think that you all already know what nature is, so why am I giving this talk in the first place? The somewhat more granular goals are, it's not advancing. There we go. I'm going to try and convince you of 3 different points throughout the talk. The first is that we're this ancient journal with a pretty unusual mission statement, which I'll come to in a bit. And that we're staffed by people who I hope I can convince you are really passionate about the science you're doing, that are full-time professional editors who will handle your submissions professionally and fairly. Ultimately, our goal in this kind of interaction is to convince you that the editors handling your papers are reasonably intelligent and will handle your work fairly. So if I can accomplish that, I will leave happy. So roughly 3 sections of the talk. The first is about just the journal itself. You're probably all quite familiar with what I would call the research part of Nature, or the back half. So if you have the print copy, you flip to the back, you get to all the articles and reviews. You're probably all roughly familiar with that. But what you may not be aware of is the vast content in the front half, or the magazine section of Nature. We go back to 1869, so over 150 years ago, Nature was born in a time when it was quite unclear what a scientific journal should be. Should it cover all fields of science, or should it cover one discipline, like glaciology, for example? Overall, the single topic journal has won out, but there are still a few, like the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, Science, Cell, and a few others, that are publishing in all fields of science. So the entity itself is really extremely unusual. We're based in these 4 main offices. We're part of a much larger for-profit corporation called Springer Nature. I began in 2008, like Jeannie said, here in London, in the Crinan Street address. It's just to the east of Regent's Park in London, in a lovely old warehouse that we bought from a receivership. Got a great deal on it. And so I came there in 2008. I moved to the Bay Area in 2010. But if you were to go to the Nature offices now, and we gave you a tour of the office, it's an exceedingly boring tour, I'm afraid, but you could see the bound history of Nature. And I think it's an interesting illustration, both of the amount of content we have since 1869, but also just the fact that the core mission statement hasn't changed in over 150 years. And I think for any organization, that's maybe worth noting. The first is that we try and publish significant advances in any field of science. That probably comes as no surprise to you, and I'll come back to that later on. The second part of our mission statement, though, which is equally important, and I think makes journals like Nature different and interesting, is that we try to provide a forum for the results to be disseminated and discussed more widely. So the outreach and the communication and the debate about science is as important to us as the publication of science. What does this look like? So I'm going to give you a few examples of the kinds of content that we have in this front or magazine section of Nature. And maybe you have ideas for things you would like to publish in Nature in one of these sections. in which case I can act as the interface between you and the editors who handle this material, because I myself don't. So we have a piece here from the news team, my colleague Nicola Jones, writing about the 1.5 warming limit. It's a popular topic for us in news. David Ho, who's an oceanographer, had a paper in our worldview section. So it's a one-pager that is meant to be on a timely topic with a potentially controversial viewpoint. And David here is saying, essentially, that carbon sequestration ideas are useless for the problem scope at hand until we get mitigation under control. David has told me that this one-page article in Nature got more interest than the integrated total of his entire scientific career before that. So they can be quite far-reaching and influential. Then we have the comment section. So I was talking with someone earlier in science, this might be called the policy forum. Comments are usually in the vein of, here's a problem, and here's a solution. An example here for climate policies that the author thinks the G7 should adopt. They're about 2,000 to 3,000 words, usually by 2 to 3 authors, and they're meant to be opinionated and provocative, but ideally moving a field forward in a productive direction. They can also be about the practice of science. So my favorite example is the comment saying that we should abandon the p-value in statistics. And this is not the opinion of the journal, this is the opinion of the author, but interesting, provocative piece there. Then we have news and views. So news and views are a sort of interesting article category where we have almost always a reviewer of a paper in Nature writing about that paper. So you might think, why in the world would we do this? This is part of our mission to try and communicate outside of immediate disciplines. So this is a paper that's looking at the ability of the Indian Ocean to moderate ocean currents in a paleoclimate sense. And Kao Tirumalai wrote some great reviews of the paper and wrote a news and views for us. So the intent here is, well, let's say that you're a modern scientist working on cloud convection. Something that's kind of divorced from this idea of the Indian Ocean moderating paleo ocean currents. The news and views should cast the piece in a broader light. Why do we care about this topic? What does it matter? How is it moving the field forward? And what are the remaining open questions? So again, it's a way of discussing the paper in a broader context from its immediate environs. That's a whistle-stop tour about the journal itself and the vast array of content we have. There's actually more. But if you have pieces in this area, and again, feel free to get a hold of me as a possible mediator with the editors there. So the editors in the back half of Nature, the research part of Nature, are a lot like you, it turns out. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got into this role. So I have a bachelor's degree in environmental science from the University of Virginia. I then took 2 years off to work in cooking and baking and catering. And my other main interest in life was food and the service industry, believe it or not. And I guess I thought at the time, well, if I get a PhD and I don't like doing science, what am I going to do with that? Of course, there are counter arguments there. Whereas if I learn how to cook, then I'll have a useful life skill to go forward. My wife is really happy that I did this. Worked out great. I still bake and cook a lot. So it's an ongoing interest, but ultimately that lifestyle just wasn't for me. And I went back to grad school in 1994, came out with a PhD in 1999, and then moved on to an academic career at Utah State University in Northern Utah, where I did work on land surface phenology, experimental science education, random topics like climate and viticulture interactions. So I was a pretty scatterbrained academic. I had a lot of different interests, which isn't necessarily the best way to build an academic career and reputation. I think I was a moderately competent academic. I didn't find getting tenure to be that hard. But what happened to me was that post-tenure, the job got radically less fun. And I found that the demands for advising, teaching, being on committees began to ramp up intensively. And I began to think about the parts of the job that I just didn't enjoy doing. So writing reports, writing grants, preparing for classes, grading papers, all of these were tasks that I could do relatively well, but they were just quite draining and I didn't like doing them. And the fun part of the job was maybe like 10% or less. And this is the time where I was due for a sabbatical in Barcelona, had a great sabbatical lined up. And then the job at Nature came up and I was like, huh, sounds interesting. And I applied in 15 minutes and interviewed, was offered the job, took 2 years of leave. So I took time off from my academic career to think about the editing job and really thinking about sort of who I am as a person. And I'm a bit of a sort of social introvert. So I like interacting with people, but I need time away from that. And the overall process of being an academic proved to be just insanely draining on my sort of my personal energies. And like I said, I was pretty scatterbrained as an academic, but being scatterbrained this also means that you're curious about a lot of different topics. And wide-ranging curiosity is kind of a prerequisite for being a long-term editor in Nature. The day-to-day of the job, very interesting, getting good papers from your community, many other communities all the time, always learning new things, getting to travel and meet passionate scientists about the work they're doing. It's very stimulating. There's few meetings. You have a lot of autonomy. You can work when you want to. The money isn't bad. It's sort of quasi-academic. So overall, it ended up being a vastly better match for what I wanted to do. And I think especially for my personality. So I've stayed with Nature. I've quit the most secure job in America. And I'm now an at-will employee at Nature. So when I think more about sort of the kind of people that we end up publishing repeatedly in Nature, really high-level scientists, they tend to have, I think, 2 out of these 3 characteristics. Brilliant, I think, is pretty self-apparent. Obsessive, meaning people who are really just possessed by the work they're doing. They probably couldn't be doing anything else but that work. They're thinking about it all the time. Or they're persuasive. And it's not like persuasive as being unethical. I mean, can you inspire people like potential graduate students, program managers, editors like me, that your work is interesting and important? And if you have just one of these, let's say you're brilliant, but you're also just exceptionally lazy, you're not going to probably reach those higher levels. And for me, I'm not high on any of these. I'm sort of medium on all of them, probably, which again is a great match for being an editor. So what do we do? What is the day-to-day activity life of an editor? This is my emoji explanation of a year in the life of my job. This is more or less the number of papers I handle in a year. It's something like 400. It's between 7 and 8 papers per year. The various flavors of things like frowny faces and bombs are things we'll get into, but it's sort of the various different reasons that we wouldn't be able to publish a paper in Nature. The white smiley faces are like the 30 papers a year that I, as a professional editor, will publish in the physical climate system. What this means is that it's a full-time job for a professional editor at Nature to publish just 30 papers in a year. This is a very low throughput. And it's a large reason that journals like Nature, not just Nature, are so expensive to produce. The rough rates are sending out about 70% of papers that come in are turned down without review. About 30% or 25% get sent out to review. And the overall rate of acceptance is roughly 7 or 8%. And this is fairly constant across disciplines, not just in physical climate sciences. So beyond that overall kind of schematic of how many papers we handle and what we do with them, we are the interface between the journal and you, the scientific community. So we do these visits to try and understand, what are you upset about? What papers have we missed? What are emerging themes in your field that we should be publishing that we're not publishing? What are lines of work that you feel are fundamentally exciting or dead ends? Like, we want to know these things from you. We want to know, what are you passionate about? What's a great comment you would like to write for us? Who are interesting reviewers that I didn't know about previously, but who might be interested in reviewing for us? So a big part of the job, again, like I said at the beginning, is networking and trying to build comfort between us and the scientific community. If you want to, you can also take on side projects. So for a few years, I ran a very nerdy science podcast where I interviewed climate scientists about their life and their work, sort of really deep dives. It was a great chance for me to learn more about these fields. So if you come on the job and you have things like this that you want to do, there is some flexibility with that. I've also done a few cultural reviews. Some have been about writing and talks. I did a review of a modern art sculpture of a snowman in a box. I was at a local art museum in California. So if you want to do these kinds of things, you probably can. There's flexibility within the job. The bulk of my talk, though, is about the papers we publish and why we publish these papers, probably the topic of most interest for you. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of science philosophy, which is how I think about the papers that I handle, and then I'll move into some very concrete examples of specific papers and categories. And the overall mission is to try and build an understanding of what are we trying to publish. So this is about the level of graphics that I deal with these days. Think about this as sort of the Einstein quote of the circle of knowledge. It's been used by Neil deGrasse Tyson and others. The concept is that the white circle is showing you all of the things that we know, and the black area outside of it is showing you all the things that we have yet to discover. The Einstein quote is, "As the circle of knowledge grows, so too does the perimeter of darkness around it." So as a circle is growing in area, the length of the perimeter is also growing, which accounts for the idea, in my own career, that the longer I worked, the more I understood that I didn't know. So this unknown area in science, as we expand our knowledge, is inevitably expanding, which you might think makes the editorial job like super easy. Whatever paper comes in that we already know what it's about, we just say, no, this is not a paper for Nature. But there are a million counter arguments to this. It might be the case that you have a new satellite that is visiting a planet, Titan, for example, a moon. And it brings back a fundamentally different idea about a topic we thought we had closed. So there are always these cases in which we revisit old topics through a new lens. For the most part, Nature isn't the place for this kind of work. There are many other examples of kinds of research that we don't usually publish in climate or in geosciences, but there are always exceptions. So normally we wouldn't publish a methodological paper, except when it's viewed as being transformative. And I've had a few discussions this morning. In my area, one example has been the application of artificial intelligence in weather forecasting, a topic I published almost nothing on for the first 14 years of my job. But I published several papers on that in the past couple of years because they've been transformative, methodological, technical advances. Replication. So replication is obviously a core part of a scientific enterprise. We will publish replication in Nature if it's on a topic like spontaneous resistance to AIDS. So we published that originally, and we published a replication study of that. So resistance that is not well explained or understood, but has happened at least twice. A really high priority item for us. Showing that a model is wrong, like observationalists and modelers love to show that models are wrong. Like this is at the top of the favorite things to do list. We would publish a paper showing a model bias if you can, first of all, demonstrate the model bias, explain why it exists, and then fix it, and show that the fix then leads to a fundamental change in our understanding of climate. You can't just complain about a model. You need to take it much farther than that. For us, for some of our other journals, you don't need to do all that. The main issue editorially is that there is no firm perimeter around the circle of knowledge. It's more like this fuzzy penumbra. And this is where most of the editorial activity takes place, in this gray area. Some categories of papers that might be in this gray area that might get sent out to review and published are topics like the most likely explanation for a long-running controversy. So I think there are probably some geologists here. Many of you have probably heard of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. 50-some million years ago, a gigantic release of carbon into the system, rapid warming, with many existing explanations for why this occurred. If you come in with another idea to explain the PETM, we usually want you to show us that your new idea is the most likely explanation. We want to understand the relative importance of your possible mechanism relative to the existing universe of explanations and be convinced that it's the most important one, not just another idea. An observational confirmation. So there are a lot of processes that exist only in the model universe. We've been chatting earlier today about glaciological topics, and there have been cases in which there's been a controversially proposed mechanism in glaciology about glacial calving, for example, that we published an observational confirmation about idea. So there are limited cases for that. Uncertainty reductions. So this is happening a lot now with climate modeling, looking at projections of the future. The uncertainties on this are quite large, but there are evolving approaches, often some form of artificial intelligence, to try and narrow down that range of uncertainty. So even if you don't have a compelling new mechanism or conceptual advance, if a topic is judged to be sufficiently important, and you can really compress those uncertainties, that alone could be enough for us. But for the most part, we're trying to be out in this area of darkness. We're trying to make fundamental advances into parts of the Earth system, into science, that we just didn't know about before. Nature's fundamental goal is to make novel and important advances on topics we just didn't really understand before. You could argue, though, that over the past 16 years, I have never succeeded in doing this with any paper I've ever published in Nature. But this is the goal. This is what we're striving for. And I think we get to various degrees of success in many of the papers that we do publish. The fundamental criteria are novelty and importance. The novelty can be judged against the existing literature somewhat straightforwardly. The importance question is editorial judgment. And what I'm going to try to do now is give you just a few examples, many of which turn out to be cryospheric. This wasn't planned in advance, of broad categories of papers that I have published in Nature. This is not an exhaustive list. There are always new categories, but this is a collection of categories that have been published quite a few times. One of them is just context. The most famous example here, of course, is Mike Mann's hockey stick paper from many years ago. This is a paper that is looking at a recoring of some of the iconic Greenland ice cores and looking at the very top portion of those and trying to contextualize the warming seen there relative to the past millennium. And what they find is that we are now at the warmest we've been in the past 1,000 years on the Greenland ice sheet. This is a straightforward contextualization of modern climate change relative to the past. So you might say, well, do you only publish things that show that we're now in some kind of unusual era? No. There have been at least 2 examples I can think of where we have done the exact opposite, showing that we are still within the realm of past variability. So it's not a one-way answer. Mechanism. I'm sorry, these are both about Thwaites, Ginny, and I know you don't, bear with me. So Thwaites is perhaps erroneously called the Doomsday Glacier. It's this glacier in Antarctica that has a couple of meters of potential sea level rise, interaction with other glacial systems. People are very interested in Thwaites Glacier. A couple of papers published in the same issue that you could argue didn't do anything to constrain our estimates of future sea level rise from Antarctica. But to me, the reason I sent them out to review was I felt they had interesting mechanistic advances. One of them shows that you have high levels of basal melt without a lot of contact of warm water. That it's sort of an isolating layer of water. Another one shows that the sharpest rates of melt are at areas where the bottom of this ice shelf have steep topography. So fairly straightforward mechanistic advances, but I thought sufficiently interesting mechanistically to take those forward. Projections, again on Antarctica. You would think that a journal like Nature in Science would be publishing lots of papers about the future. The reality is, for both journals, it's quite rare. Like for me, it's a few papers per year. I think in 2023, I had maybe 3 or 4. It's actually quite uncommon. But here's a paper by Lee and England and colleagues, and they're looking at the idea, well, what's going to happen to overall ocean circulation if we have a sharp increase in meltwater from Antarctica, and projecting a fairly alarming reduction in the production of what's called deep water from Antarctica. Arguments. So people think, well, we publish papers in Nature just to have argumentation. This is emphatically not true. But we do recognize that there are debates in the field that people really care about. One of them relates to the mid-Holocene, so roughly 6,000 years ago. There's been work showing that we've been warming monotonically since the mid-Holocene. There's been other work showing that the mid-Holocene was kind of warm, then we cooled down, have been warming back up sharply since then. So for the Holocene, the most recent epoch, we don't really have a firm idea on this. And if we can't get down our most recent warm period, what hope do we have for the Pliocene or the Miocene or something like this? So Daryl Kaufman and Ellie Broadman wrote a review for us that synthesized the available evidence and came to the conclusion that the bulk of evidence does support the idea of a mid-Holocene warm period. And this has already stirred up a lot of additional debate on the topic, but we do like to weigh in on these long-running debates. Resource value papers. So I've heard the comment that science publishes data and we publish stories in Nature. I think there's a high appetite for mechanistic explanations in Nature. But we do publish a lot of papers whose main value is just as a resource to both a wide community and to the larger public. This is a pretty common form of publication for us. Sea ice thickness. We've had estimates of summertime ice thickness for quite a long time. We've been tracking sort of the September sea ice thickness for a while, but getting year-round sea ice thickness has been technically very problematic for a long time. And this team finally seems to have cracked that topic and is now able to produce year-round estimates of Arctic sea ice. And just as a resource value paper, we felt sufficient to proceed. Surprises. So in the old days of Nature, a surprise would be like, I've gone out in my backyard and here is a new butterfly. Or I pulled up my fishing line and there was a large crab attached to it. I'm not making these up. But now it's things like this. So this paper came in, the technologies here are nothing new. This group, Julian Dowswell's group, has been doing similar things for a while. But what they show, these are corrugations on the bed of the ocean. So looking at the seafloor itself. And these corrugations are where the older ice sheets lifted and unlifted and moved. And from that, you're able to infer that on areas of relatively flat bathymetry, the ice sheet could be moving hundreds of meters per day. And to me, that was just like, that's a lot. So again, not mechanistically surprising that the ice sheet can move quickly, but the surprise was the reason to take it forward. So again, that's just a very broad overview of what we publish in Physical Climate. And like I said, there are always exceptions. But it may be that you have come into Nature and either before or after review, your paper has been declined for publication. Then you think, well, I'm going to go to Science or PNAS. Of course, that's your decision. But we now have a transfer system, and we now have an enormous family of journals with the goal of being able to publish every paper that is technically correct. So we should be able to find a home for your paper somewhere within our family of journals. It may not have a Nature title on it, but there's likely to be a home. So this is infinitely confusing for authors, honestly, for editors as well. So I've come up with an analogy that relates back to my own interest in food and cooking, which is the Michelin Guide. So the Michelin Guide is it's a tire company, obviously. They write a tour guide where they rank hotels and restaurants. So let's go with the analogy that our journals are like the Michelin restaurant ranking system. Nature, of course, is a 3-star restaurant. This is the highest level of ranking in the Michelin system. There's only one in our system. The idea here, in the Michelin sense, is that it's extraordinary cuisine worth a special trip. So if you're somebody who is interested in this kind of food, you would make a trip from Japan to come to the Bay Area to go eat at a restaurant that has a 3-star ranking. It has to have that level of appeal to encourage someone to make this long journey. And I was having this chat earlier, like, what does that mean with Nature, right? What it means is that if you're one of these scientists who writes papers on stem cells or cancer indicators that have these titles that are just completely incomprehensible, would you be willing to make a special trip to read the first paragraph of a paper about glaciology? Not the whole paper, not even the whole news and views, But if we have a paper about glaciology in Greenland, would it have that level of broader interest on a sort of first paragraph of a News and Views to get a stem cell scientist to come and check it out? That's what we're kind of thinking about. That's the level of broader interest it needs to have for Nature, ideally. Then a Michelin 2-star restaurant is excellent cooking, worth a detour. So if you're here in Austin and you're up here in the north, it's a barbecue restaurant in the south going to be worth making a detour to go down there. The way I think about this I'm calling them our Nature X journals. So Nature Climate Change, Nature Geoscience, Photonics, Materials, Human Behavior, Robotics, on and on and on. In those journals, let's think about Nature Climate Change. If you're a person who is working on the sociology of climate change in a particular location or country or context, would that scientist want to go and look at a paper about cloud convection? So it should be able to communicate within a broadly defined field, but across the subdisciplines within that field. At a 1-star level, you essentially have very good cooking within its cuisine. And I think about Nature Communications in that context. If you're looking at the field of, again, let's just say cloud convection, a paper on cloud convection should be able to appeal to that audience. It should be one of the best 5 or 6 papers, most interesting papers on that one topic within a given year. It doesn't need to appeal to people who are doing oceanography or glaciology or something like that. It needs to be a core paper for that community. That's more or less the audience for Nature Communications. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, what is the equivalent of a bib gourmand, right? So a bib gourmand is a restaurant in the Michelin Guide where you can go and you get a good meal, 3 courses for a set price. It can be pretty good, solid, reliable. So our communications journals fit this kind of category. In this community, it would be Communications, Earth, and Environment. Thinking about the cloud convection example, a paper here could have a narrower audience. It could be the community looking at new particle formation. So how do particles form in clouds? What is their very specific and specialist level cloud aerosol interaction? It needs to appeal at a high level to a narrowly defined discipline. So in general, what you're seeing is that the breadth of the audience goes from very broad to narrow as you proceed through our journals. Then we have a journal like Scientific Reports. So Scientific Reports publishes like 30,000 papers a year. It's a mega journal like PLOS One. And I think about this as being like excellent barbecue in the Austin context. So, let's say you've gone to your favorite barbecue restaurant 20 years ago, and you leave town to do a different academic career, and then you come back. Maybe if you've retired, you want to come live in Austin again, and you go back to that barbecue restaurant 20 years later. This is still great. I love this, right? So that's replication. This is not to say that replication is easy. Having that kind of quality for 20 years is very hard. Replication studies, as I mentioned, are a core part of science, and Scientific Reports is a great place to publish replication studies or to publish negative findings. You conduct a study and you found that there was no effect. This wouldn't have the level of interest probably for Nature, but we should be publishing negative results, and Scientific Reports is a great place to be doing that. So with that, I'll wrap up and I'll show you this one image of the roughly 120 people that were at our 150th workshop celebration in 2019, right before the pandemic. And the point to make here is, for one thing, that Nature is run largely at the upper level by women. So this is quite different than some academic environments. At least from a gender perspective, we have very high diversity in the job. I think it's extremely family friendly in terms of the leave policies. If you're living in the UK, Germany, you can leave for a year, come back, your job is still there. Nothing has really changed. So I like that part about it. We're doing less well in other parts of diversity, but it's overall a lovely place to work. I'm happy to talk about potential careers in editing, and many thanks to Ginny for organizing. And there's my email, the podcast, and there's my unused Twitter handle as well. Thanks very much. So I think we should have plenty of time for questions. I have a list of popular question topics here in case anybody needs any suggestions about questions.
So the microphone's at each table. If you hold down the button for a couple of seconds, it should light up and folks on Zoom can hear you then.
Yes.
I've known Marcia McNutt for about 40 years. When she was editor-in-chief of Science, we discussed how science was working its way towards being a health sciences journal. And we discussed how hard it was to get an Earth Sciences article in Science. The pendulum swung back a little bit since she left, but do you see in nature an evolution towards certain, I mean, you're a climate guy. Do you think climate is, if you're not a climate person, let's say you study crustal structure of continental margins, which is what I do. What's your guess about how hard it is to get into nature now in one subject versus another? Because the rap on nature for me over years has been its equivalent to a news journal. It's got to be newsy to get published. How do you feel about that?
So I think there's a lot of different questions in there. Actually, I'm really interested to hear you say that about science, because we track our own publications, we track science publications, and their publication in climate science has just plummeted. We used to be roughly equal, and now, in my last checks, they publish about a third of what we publish. And maybe that was an intentional choice on their part. So the question that you ended on was, do we publish, is Nature just a news organization? And do we have to have really newsy work? I was having a discussion about a paper we published by John Chang showing that there's an eccentricity control on El Nino variability in the Eastern Equatorial Pacific. That is 100% not a newsy paper. It will never get news coverage. I published papers on theoretical climatology in aquaplanet super greenhouse worlds. That will never get coverage. So our main interest is the novelty and what we view as being the importance of the paper, which might intersect with newsworthiness, but by no means is guided by that. So we're looking at the novelty and the importance of, in those cases, the mechanistic advances, not the newsy advances. So I would push back against the assertion that we publish only newsy things. Some of them are certainly newsy, but that's never the primary consideration. In terms of how hard it is to publish papers in Nature, I think that there have been many cases in the past where authors have submitted 10, 15, 20 papers to us, and we have rejected them all without review. And in those cases, usually what is happening is that the authors are sending us work that is potentially incredibly strong technically, and they may feel this is the best work they've ever done, but it doesn't have the level of broader interest. It could be just at a mechanistic level, not at a newsiness level. And that can be very confusing for authors. They're thinking, I'm sending you my best work and you always reject it. What's going on? That's usually the reason why. It has nothing to do with technical merit. It has to do with a broader interest. Yes, Ginny.
Take on cover letter. I am interested in your take on cover letters and their importance.
Okay, so the question is on cover letters and their importance. So this is kind of like going to be a long-winded answer. In the first year of my job, I would routinely get topics that I had never heard about in my entire life before. Like literally, I didn't even know the field existed. And in those cases, the cover letter is incredibly helpful. If an author can step back and imagine that they're talking to somebody who's interested, hopefully intelligent, but may not know their field, you can just say, this is what I found. This is why it matters to my field, and this is how it will change the way that people do work in this field going forward. Like, that is super helpful to us to know that. And now that I've been doing this for 16 years, that part of it is not usually that helpful for me. But I do occasionally go on holiday, and it might be the case that you have an economist handling your paper. You just don't know. We have cover systems within the journal, and that person is still competent, but having a good cover letter can only help in that case. The other thing you can do is say which reviewers you think would be appropriate for your paper or inappropriate for your paper. You can't exclude an entire continent as potential. So people have tried this actually. You can't request a male editor or something like this, which people have also tried. So, but you can make reasonable recommendations for good reviewers and reviewers you want to exclude. Up to 2 individuals or groups can be excluded. So I think those are kind of the main reasons, setting the broader context why your paper matters and is important, and reviewer recommendations. Yes, in the back. Yeah. Mhm. Sure. So I'll try to restate the question and you can tell me if I got it right. I think the question is, are there biases in play either against early career researchers or in favor of longtime established scientists? Okay, so no and no. But I love publishing papers by people I don't know. And it happens on a fairly regular basis. I publish papers that are led by grad students I don't know on a routine basis, or author groups I've never heard of before in my life. Like, we always want to have new people coming into the system and bringing new ideas. The system is not triple blind, which means that I always do know who the authors are. And we have to recognize the possibility that there are unconscious biases that I'm not aware of that are coming into play. But in terms of a conscious bias, I really don't think so for ECRs. For established scientists, I think about it in the sense of, imagine every day you walk down the street and you see one of two people every day. One of them always hits you in the face and the other one always gives you a croissant. It's like you have expectations about what you are going to get. This is unavoidable. You cannot stop your brain from having these expectations. So what you have to do is to recognize that about yourself and say, well, look, I know that the way the behavioral psychology works here, I know that I have a paper coming in from someone who I've published 10 times in the past 10 years. I need to be evaluated on the merits of the paper, not the person. Right? That is easier said than done. What I will say in support of my argument is evidence you can't verify, which is that the groups we publish on a regular basis have an unbelievably high throughput of submissions, only a very small portion of which are published. Nonetheless, because of the overall rate of submissions and the fact that we do publish some of them, it looks like a lot of papers. This can come across looking as favoritism. I don't think that it is, but it's very hard for me to definitively say that that is not the case. But that's how I think about it, and that's how I try to approach it. Yes.
There we go. Transitioning from the topic of bias, I mean, obviously you have a certain bias by the selection of topics that you cover, right? And then looking at your editorial list, you don't have a geologist on your.
Oh, we do.
Well, you
John
have
Van de Kar.
geoscientists, but
No, John is a geologist.
okay.
Mental
But
conductor.
you have, obviously, if you look at the distribution of editorials across the disciplines,
Yes.
you have biases, right?
Yes.
But let me back up here a little bit. I think that science journalism is in a big crisis. If I look at what the news media report as scientific reporting, it is trying to be sensationalist, which is obviously what the media do, right? They try to create a buzz. And I wonder if actually magazines or journals like Science and Nature are part of the problem by trying to bring the hottest and most provocative science.
Right.
And I would argue that's not how science really works, right? It is incremental ultimately, right?
Sure.
And the high impact work, it may take replication, it may take years until this crystallizes, right? Nobel Prizes are usually not given out the year after, right? It takes time for this to mature. So is your objective really valid? Is trying to predict, in essence, what the biggest current science is. And you had this diagram where you had the white spot far out of your black area, and you said, I think you admitted that you rarely hit the mark in making the right decision here. So
no, not making the right decision in reaching the goal.
Yeah,
Not because papers that would have reached there, but just that there aren't papers that tend to do that.
it's inherently hard to do, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's a fundamental flaw, and then you have the topic here of retractions. It's
Mhm.
people say that they
Yeah.
have their highest rate
Sure.
of retraction, right? Which shows that it's you may overreach in some cases, right? And so is it really still a timely effort in the times of the Google and now artificial intelligence to try to screen the best and the most timely and most relevant papers? Is this even achievable? Should we even pursue this?
Right. So
You know, what is your role in that?
I think
You know,
there-
I mean,
there-
150 years ago, yes, but today,
there's a lot of questions in that. I think I could paraphrase your overall criticism as, shouldn't we be publishing more boring research? That seems to be what you're saying, that we shouldn't be publishing interesting work.
no, interesting,
But so I would say that publishing what we perceive as interesting work is always going to be to some degree controversial. There will be retractions, there will be what we have called matters arisings. But I would not accept the point that we should not try to publish interesting and provocative and controversial work for fear that it might be rejected or revised in the future. Like many editors-in-chief ago, John Maddox was asked a question not unlike this. He was sort of said, how many of your papers in Nature will be shown to be incorrect in the future? And John said, in typical John fashion, all of them. They will all be revised substantially in the future. And this is the natural progression of science. So I don't view the role of journals like Nature and Science or Cell or PNAS or JAMA or any of these high-profile journals to retreat from potentially controversial or even incorrect work. Our job is to publish interesting work and to push science forward. And I think that those are inherently a tension between risk and interest. I had a similar discussion with someone who, over the course of a day, said to me, basically, why don't you publish more boring work? And then why don't you take more risks, right? So these are the two endpoints. And you're always going to have high risk when you have controversial papers, but that's part of the operation of the journal. I'm not sure I got totally to your question, but maybe more than we can get at.
I mean, I guess the question is, why not? Why do we have to? You have this tier of high selective, and then you have the lowest rank, where
Right.
you more or less publish everything, right?
Right.
Why do we still need this?
Well, what would be your preferred
We
model?
just publish and then let this sort it out by itself. You
Oh,
know?
yeah, absolutely.
know?
So the sort of the post-publication review model has been adopted by eLife, for example. So eLife makes an additional, they still make an initial editorial cut on papers, but then they let authors decide when to stop the review process. So authors can push the publish button whenever they want to in the review process. There's no real filtering in the end for whether the paper is right or not. You could argue that we should just publish everything on preprints. Why do we even need journals? Why do we need editors? Why don't we just put everything on to preprint servers, which would be the post-review model? Then you have a situation in which a tiny % of the papers that are published are actually reviewed by anybody. Maybe this would be your preferred model. We prefer a model in which we have interesting controversial work that from our perspective has gone through a rigorous technical review. You will decide which model you prefer. So if the community stops submitting to Nature, then we will die. And we will perhaps move towards a preprint only model. But for me, I still see a lot of value in what we're doing in terms of this filtering and discussion, dissemination, and enhancement of the papers, which includes interfacing with our press office. And a lot of the interface there is to try and moderate the press coverage, not to amp it up. Yes, in the back.
I'm curious about what the process is, whether someone is new. Just curious about how you process and determine something's new. Is that the
Yeah.
author making the argument? Is it in your technical review as you go through? How
Sure.
do you know what's really new?
So I think that in the future, we may be lurching towards a world where an LLM, a large language model, is making that judgment for us and coming back with a novelty score. But as of now, we are not doing that. So it's me reading the paper and thinking about it. And in many cases, I know right away that it doesn't have the right level of novelty for us. So a classic case of this would be a novel demonstration of a well-known phenomenon. So there is an enormous universe of papers looking at teleconnections in the climate system, that something like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation has an impact on moisture status, let's say in the southwestern US. If you're then showing that it has a moisture implication in the northwestern US, maybe that's novel, but from our perspective, it's not conceptually novel to show that there are moisture-related teleconnections from the PDO. So like the narrow novelty is there, but the wider novelty for us is not. So there's no one way to think about novelty in this situation, which I realize is an incredibly unsatisfactory answer. But what I will do if a paper comes in and I read the literature, I look at the citation list and like, it's kind of marginal, but I don't think it's novel because of these 3 papers. Then when I write the rejection letter to you, I will say, your paper isn't sufficiently novel for us because of these 3 papers. And what I'm doing, in fact, is giving you an opening to appeal. By giving you specifics, you can say, well, Mike, he's clearly off base on this. I know that those papers don't compromise my novelty. And then you can come back and argue with me, and we can have this discussion. So the more nuanced a decision gets on novelty, typically the more explanation I will give the authors. Yes.
So great presentation. My question is, if you consider a lot of fields of science, finding the novelty would get a lot harder because a person like understanding of the state of art is limited to the previous readings of papers. So if you consider the criteria of nature very high, you may not be able to rely on a reviewer to decide about it. So are you using some machine learning tools to understand which one is novel, which one is not? Because you need to scan a lot of state of art or current knowledge about a variety of sciences.
So I think the question is more or less, are we using some kind of machine learning to help us judge the novelty of research? So as of now, no. I think this could happen in the future. So we're relying on both the editors to know the field well enough to make that initial judgment on novelty, to read the literature as necessary, and then when you can't figure it out, to ask the reviewers themselves directly about novelty. But it is hard, you're right.
I have a second question.
Okay.
So is the editor-in-chief role changing, like to different people within a period, like the other journals, or because naturally it may deviate the papers toward a specific field of science, for example, climate or?
The editorial roles, both for editors like me and for the editor-in-chief, are not fixed-term rotation roles like they would be for an AGU or an EGU journal. So we've had editors who have been in the role for over 30 years. The current editor-in-chief she's been there for, I think, 4 or 5 years, but there's no fixed term. The editor-in-chief has relatively little interaction with the day-to-day editors. So they're responsible for setting overall policy goals for the journal and identifying new areas of research that we want to be pursuing. So for example, Philip Campbell, our previous editor-in-chief, got very interested in sociology. So all of our journals that we now have that are Nature Human Behavior, Nature Sustainability, some degree Nature Climate Change, are because Phil was interested in sociology. So there are cases in which at a high level, the journal will decide we haven't been covering this enough. We want to stop being a purely natural science journal and branch out into these other areas, which for me includes climate economics. So at that level, the editors-in-chief do have a role in setting this overall strategy, but there's no fixed term to limit that. All right, thank you, everybody.